Welcome to the EBP OT podcast with your host, Kim Griffin. Welcome to another episode of the EBP OT podcast, where I help you stay up to date with the current research in paediatric OT. My name is Kim Griffin, I'm a paediatric OT and your host. Today we are exploring a few articles linked to supporting sensory needs in schools. The first considers how professional development was helpful for educators. The next article explores implementation of Tier 1 and 2 supports in schools, so universal and targeted sensory supports. If you'd like to receive the links to the articles and the show notes, you can join my mailing list at ebpot.com. If you are already a member, just check your inbox and the email will be there waiting for you. So the first article is titled The Impact of Professional Development on Knowledge of Sensory Integration and Sensory Processing for Educators, a Mixed Methods Study. It was published in the Journal of Occupational Therapy Schools and Early Intervention in July 2025. It's a mixed methods study by Knebloch and colleagues. If you're working in schools, you'll know that differences in sensory processing are common across many diagnostic groups, including autism and ADHD. These sensory differences can significantly impact children's participation at school and their access to education. While school-based occupational therapists have specialised expertise that can support sensory needs, the reality is that collaboration with teachers is essential for maximising student success. Teachers also report that they're motivated to learn new strategies and cite collaboration as occupational therapists as valuable. However, the literature suggests that there are limited evidence-based training opportunities for educators on sensory needs, and little research examining the impact of specific training designed for educators to help this population. The study examined the impact of a professional development training on sensory integration and sensory processing designed specifically for educators. The researchers had 3 specific research questions. First, what is the influence of professional development to enhance educators' knowledge of sensory integration and processing? Second, what is the influence of professional development to enhance educators' perceptions of their abilities to problem-solve classroom management strategies? And third, what are educator perceptions of supports and barriers in their school and district to providing students with the needed supports? The team used a mixed methods design, and there were 3 data collection tools: field notes taken by the researcher, course reflections completed by the educators at the end of the course, and a retrospective survey containing open-ended and Likert scale questions. Participation was open to educators working in schools in a Midwestern state in the United States. Recruitment took place through a local education agency website and through word of mouth. 15 educators attended the full training and 11 completed informed consent to become research participants. The educators worked across different year groups and only 1 identified as specifically being a special education teacher. The participants attended 2 days of training delivered over 3 weeks by an occupational therapist. The content covered the 8 sensory systems, how sensory differences impact classroom participation, and how to identify support strategies using Lucy Miller's A Secret framework. A SEGRET stands for Attention, Sensation, Emotional Regulation, Culture, Relationship, Environment, and Task. If you're not familiar with this framework, it's outlined very comprehensively in Lucy Miller's book, A Secret, and I've included the link to the book in the episode show notes at ebpot.com. So, let's look at the results. We'll start with the qualitative findings, and the researchers identified 3 different themes that these fell into. The first theme was understanding sensory needs. This included educators developing a changed understanding not only of their students' sensory needs, but also of their own. One substitute teacher reported that the course provided me with an additional piece of the puzzle, whilst a high school educator reflected, as I read through my notes, I continue to be amazed at how much sensory processing has to do with the development of children. Within this theme, educators explored their own sensory preferences and realised how these influenced classroom choices. One teacher noted, I have looked at myself and my students in a new way. I've been able to recognise how things that I dislike affect how I react to situations. Educators also reported a greater understanding of how sensory processing influences student engagement in learning and the relationships between observable behaviours and sensory features both within and outside the classroom. One preschool teacher stated, "I now understand the difference between behaviour and sensory processing differences, and that adjustments can be made for more effective learning." The second theme reflected that educators had increased the number of available strategies that they could use and had a deeper understanding of why and how to use the tools. Many reported that they'd been told to implement sensory strategies previously but weren't sure why, which led to misuse or abandonment. Educators engaged with the strategies themselves during the training. They were trying weighted blankets, chewing gum, and different musical beats. One participant stated, "To my surprise, these simple techniques really did help in calming me down to an appropriate level." This personal experience seemed to influence their belief about the value of strategies. The educators were also able to identify the importance of matching strategies to individual needs. Between the training sessions, educators attempted strategies with their students and reported successes, including one teacher noting a student's assignment grade improved after implementing accommodations. The third theme related to supports and barriers for implementing sensory strategies. Educators identified that they did actually have access to occupational therapists, but they might not have previously engaged with this support. They also noted that much of the equipment suggested in the training was actually already available in their school. Barriers included the cost and time concerns relating to allowing staff to attend the training, and I know that's certainly something I see in the UK all the time at the moment. Quite often staff are given 20-minute or 40-minute twilight sessions, and actually releasing staff for a full day or 2 days is actually very challenging. And also the costs associated with purchasing equipment was seen as a barrier, and some educators had purchased tools for their own classroom using their own money, and they'd noted that doing this school-wide could be quite costly. Again, this is something I see day to day in schools when I go in. Teachers are quite often funding resources in the classroom. So what are our practical takeaways? For school-based OTs, this study provides some evidence that there is value in providing professional development to educators on sensory processing. The educators really liked the 2-day format with a gap between the sessions. I'm not sure if I explained that very well in the results, but there was one session and then a 2-week gap and then the second session. And they felt this allowed them to try the strategies and return with questions. So it's really useful to consider this format when we're planning our own professional development with educators. They also found that the A Secret framework, so that's Lucy Miller's framework, and the link to that is in the show notes, provided educators with a structured problem-solving tool which gave them specific areas to consider when analysing sensory needs, and they could apply the framework across different situations. One finding that stood out to me was that the educators valued understanding their own sensory preferences and found that that helped them to really appreciate their students' needs. And I quite often do this in my training, but I wouldn't say that I would do this all of the time. So it's a reminder to me to sort of build in that self-awareness into any training that I am delivering, as the educators reported that that really did change their approach when supporting their students. And I think the study highlights the importance of ongoing collaboration. Educators reported that they increased the use of occupational therapists following the training. So in the area, they had access to a consultative hotline almost. And a lot of the educators weren't using that before the training, but after the training, they were using it more. And this suggests that professional development can really strengthen that interprofessional working. We do need to observe some caution with these results, though, as the study didn't include any objective measures of student outcomes or classroom observations, and it relied solely on educator report. A longer follow-up period would have been valuable to understand whether the initial enthusiasm and reported knowledge gains translated into a sustained change in classroom practice. It would also have been fantastic to include a student outcome measure to see whether the changes led to measurable improvements for students. However, I can appreciate why the researchers focused on teachers' perspectives, as it is much easier to gain consent from educators to participate in research. And when you are, as I have found while setting up my own PhD studies, a small team or working within set periods of time within research programs, it can sometimes be incredibly challenging to also gain parental consent for study involvement. And although student outcomes weren't measured, this study offers a really useful starting point for future research into the outcomes of educator professional development focused on sensory needs in the classroom. Just a reminder of the live training that I'm offering in January. My sensory series is running over 5 weeks, starting on the 5th. There are still places available. I'll be focused on sensory-based interventions, so not direct ASI treatment. Over the 5 sessions, I'll explore the history and different models, the evidence, assessment strategies, and how to use sensory-based interventions successfully at home and school. You can also book week 2 of the sensory series, where I explore current evidence, which is available for using sensory supports as a standalone workshop. This workshop is happening on January the 12th. The second article is titled Multi-Tier Systems of Support, the Effect of Sensory Processing Tier 1 and Tier 2 Occupational Therapy Intervention Workshops and Consultation on Kindergarten Students. And it was published in the Journal of Occupational Therapy Schools and Early Intervention in July 2025. It's a quasi-experimental cohort study by Boitano and colleagues. I know quasi-experimental sounds really complicated, but it just means that the research either lacked a control group or participants were not assigned into groups at random. The study had 3 specific research questions. First, does teacher participation in a weekly manualized response to intervention Tier 1 and Tier 2 occupational therapy intervention improve teachers' utilization of strategies to support student sensory processing? Second, does teacher workshop on sensory processing plus 1 occupational therapy consultation each trimester improve teachers' utilization of strategies? And third, does a teacher workshop alone improve teachers' utilization of strategies to support self-regulation and sensory processing? You can see from the research aims that it's exploring a very similar topic to the first article. 3 kindergartens were recruited from 2 elementary schools in San Jose, California. For those not in the US, children are typically 5 when they enter kindergarten, so it's equivalent to a UK Year 1 class. And the classrooms received 3 different levels of intervention. The students in Classroom 1 received weekly 1-hour interventions provided by university occupational therapy graduate students, consisting of Tier 1, classroom-wide, with all 20 students for 1 hour, and Tier 2, a small group of 4 students randomly assigned into each group, intervention over 10 weeks. The intervention incorporated aspects of zones of regulation curriculum and self-regulation strategies, including education on calming corners, understanding feelings and internal states, and how to utilize sensory tools. The teacher in Classroom 2 attended a 1-hour workshop on understanding sensory behaviours and sensory processing strategies, plus they had access to bi-weekly email or in-person occupational therapy consultations, and the teacher in Classroom 3 only attended the 1-hour workshop. The data was collected at the beginning of the intervention in January and again 10 weeks after. The Strengths and Difficulty Questionnaire was used as a screening tool. If you're not familiar with the Strengths and Difficulty Questionnaire, I've included the link to the forms in the show notes. This measure was only completed at the start for all children. It was not completed at the end as it was used as a screening tool. The sensory processing measure was then completed for students who scored above average on the Strengths and Difficulty Questionnaire. The sensory processing measure was completed before and after the intervention for these students. In addition, there was a teacher questionnaire which was designed by the research team, which explored understanding and implementation of sensory processing, and a zones of regulation staff implementation survey. The study included 44 kindergarten students across 3 classrooms. The groups were not of equal size, so Classroom 1 had 11 participants, Classroom 2 had 15, and Classroom 3 had 18. The average age of the children was 5.9 years, and there were 3 teachers, so 1 in each classroom, providing feedback. So what did the researchers find? There were differences between the classrooms at baseline. So students in Classrooms 1 and 2 had significantly higher total difficulty scores and lower prosocial scores on the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire compared to Classroom 3. This indicated that students in Classrooms 1 and 2 had more behavioural challenges and less social competence at the start. The sensory processing measure 2 total average pretest score reflected a similar pattern, with Classroom 1 and 2 scoring with more sensory needs than Classroom 3 on their SPM. Only the SPM was completed after the intervention, and there were no significant differences on the students' SPM scores before or after the intervention. This probably won't surprise a lot of us who use the SPM, as it often doesn't change, and I can think of examples where the scores actually increased after parents and teachers had more understanding of sensory needs because they were scoring it with more of a sensory lens and a sensory view on the behaviour. There's a lot more detailed analysis reported in the article regarding the changes on individual subscales on the SPM, and if you're interested in this, I'd recommend you read the article. If you are reading the results, please do bear in mind that much of the data is presented in percentages, and because the group sizes are small, the results initially sound a lot bigger than they might actually be, as sometimes only one child represents 20%. In addition, due to the low numbers in each group, there's low statistical power for the between group analysis, and there's a high risk of type 1 and 2 errors. This is where false negative or false positive results could be shown because the sample size is so small. The teachers reported understanding and implementation of sensory processing strategies showed some changes. The researchers also interviewed the teachers to find out their perspectives of the training, and there were 5 main themes from these interviews. We need to remember that this data is from 3 teachers, so it's quite a small sample size. First, teachers reported very limited prior professional development on sensory needs, and that they had challenges understanding which strategies to use and when. For example, one teacher stated that they had difficulty recognizing what tools are for what situations. This actually aligns with a lot of the data in the first study that I presented around teachers sort of saying they had the tools, but they weren't sort of sure why they should use them. Second, teachers shared how they implemented sensory tools and zones of regulation concepts and noted that these resulted in positive impacts on classroom dynamics. One teacher observed that previous brain breaks involving dancing and music didn't work with their current group, and this sort of helped to demonstrate that there's that increased awareness of students' individual needs. And I suppose clinically that's something I see quite a lot. Teachers are using things like movement breaks, but they're not necessarily using them maybe at the best time. For example, using them straight after lunch when the children have already been out running around, or they might be using a movement break when the child maybe might need some more calming activities. So it's that piece around matching strategies with needs. Third, the teachers expressed strong appreciation for the occupational therapy support, so they valued being able to pick each other's brains and discuss issues in real time, and they found it easier to communicate with parents when the information came from a professional. Fourth, parent and senior leadership support emerged as important factors. So teachers noted that senior leadership support and budget availability facilitated implementation, whilst parents' disclosure of diagnoses. Finally, teachers reported perspective changes. One teacher reflected, "I think it's made me a better teacher, and now I think my toolbox has a lot more in it for recognizing things." So the practical takeaways from the teacher's perspective are very similar to the first study I presented. Teachers clearly valued the occupational therapy input and felt more equipped to support their students, and reported seeing positive changes in classroom dynamics even when the standardized measures didn't reflect this. Whilst the study attempted to measure student outcomes, they only did this for students flagged as having difficulties on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire pretest, and the chosen outcome measure, a sensory processing measure, didn't show statistically significant changes on total scores. I think it would have been interesting if the research team had also have completed the Strengths and Difficulty questionnaire in the post-test, as this has more questions on engagement and social behaviour. We've also considered in other podcasts that standardized test measures don't always show change post-intervention, so this finding is not unique. It can sometimes be difficult to find standardized measures that are sensitive enough to measure change during short intervention periods. The team suggested that the strong correlation between the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire and the SPM could make the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire a useful screening tool in practice. The SDQ is free, quick to administer, and accessible to teachers, and it could help to identify which students might benefit from a more comprehensive sensory processing assessment. They suggested this could help with referral processes to OT and prioritisation of caseload. However, we need to be mindful that the tool doesn't specifically consider occupation or participations, and the questions are very behaviour focused. So for me, I think it's unlikely it could be the only screening tool we are using to identify appropriate referrals. You can come to your own conclusions though. I've included a link to the SDQ for those who aren't familiar with it in the show notes. I just want to mention one paper that was published in the American Journal of OT by Whiting and colleagues, and it's titled Guidelines for Occupational Therapy Using Air Sensory Integration in School-Based Practice, a Validation Study. This paper has explored the development of the guidelines that they're talking about. The reason that I'm not presenting it is because it does not include the guidelines themselves, rather it presents the background work that has gone into the guideline development. So for therapists on the ground, there's not a lot of practical applications. If you're a researcher developing a tool, the methodology and analysis might be very relevant to you. The authors have also presented on the topic themselves recently, and I'll include a link to this presentation on the ebpot.com website in the show notes for this episode. When I contacted them, the authors said that the guidelines will be available as training in the future, so we just need to keep an eye out for that. Thanks for listening today. In the next episode, I'll be looking at 3 articles which explore inclusive practice within education settings. The first is a theoretical paper considering how belonging supports inclusion in school. The second explores a model for an inclusive school, which was co-created, and the final article discusses the experience of neurodivergent students who have struggled to attend school due to anxiety. You can receive notifications of new episodes and the links to the episode notes by joining my mailing list at ebpot.com. Thanks for listening today. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please give it a rating and also share it with another pediatric OT you know. This episode has originally been released over the December holiday period, so I hope you're having a really nice break, and I look forward to seeing you for the next episode. Don't forget the first journal club is on January 27th, and the details are in the show notes. This podcast provides educational commentary and analysis of recent research for continuing professional development. All studies are properly cited and used under the fair use provisions for educational purposes. Listeners should consult the original sources for complete study details.